Now on another subject. You know, I said when I was doing that Western little thing there about my love for character actors. Well, I just picked up a book I'm going to show you in a minute. I got to stop buying cheap fucking lighters, you know that? Invest in a Bic. But I don't know. We make so much money doing this and being cool, you know. But not really. But anyway, let me pull this out here. But I'm killing the pumpkin. People should recognize this guy. He's probably one of the most familiar faces ever to appear on screen. Richard Jaeckel. Again, if you're my age and you lived in the New York area, you know every Sunday afternoon, right after lunch, or even during lunch, dinner, whatever, we got a fucking shitload of war movies, because we actually won a war back then, World War II. And Richard Jaeckel, it seemed, was in every fucking World War II movie ever made. Not really, but one of the first ones I had seen him in was Guadalcanal Diary, where he was basically 16 years old. He was discovered on a Paramount lot or whatever, or the mail clerk or something like that. He was going to enlist, but they made him this offer to, to play this, young private chicken. And that's where I remember seeing him. And the funny part was, to me and everybody else, he never aged. Richard kept himself in tremendous physical condition. He was a weightlifter, a surfer, a beach bum. Some of his close friends were like Arnold Schwarzenegger, William Smith, Lee Marvin, a bunch of these guys. And the thing is, Richard was probably one of the most versatile character actors ever. He could play a complete, cool good guy, or he could play a sadistic fucking heavy. And, he was in 310 to Yuma, Chisholm, films like that, westerns as a bad guy. And then he'd be a heroic soldier in things like Guadalcanal Diary, Attack, Sands of Iwo Jima, as a good guy. Thing with Richard was, he just appeared in just about every genre of movie there ever was, but never got the brass ring. It's just weird. It just seemed like it eluded him, because when you go back to the Magnificent Seven, he was noted for westerns, but weirdly, I believe reading something, and it might have been alluded to in this book, that he was probably would have been the guy who would have taken the Robert Vaughn character Lee. But there was a writer's strike or some kind of strike going on where the casting was frozen and Lee was already in. So they couldn't do a switcheroo or whatever. I know that James Coburn was the one who petitioned for Lee to get in. But the director, John Sturgis, had worked with Richard before, and it seemed, Richard would have been a lock. And as we all know, everybody connected, every one of the seven, and Eli Wallach became a superstar. Another thing was, he was in the very, very successful and popular film The Dirty Dozen as the sergeant, Lee Marvin's sergeant. And the thing about that was, Lee Marvin had come up with, a friend of his had come up with the treatment that would eventually become the Wild Bunch. And Lee would have been cast as Pike Bishop in the Wild Bunch, and Richard would have been his second in command, Dutch. But unfortunately, Lee's agent talked him into doing Paint Your Wagon, and we all know how that ended up, so it was never to be. But Richard kept on working, and some good stuff, some bad stuff. He went over to Japan and did The Green Slime and Latitude Zero. He went over to Europe and did Killing Machine with Lee Van Cleef. He was another bad guy. He worked for Bud Cardos in The Dark as a police detective. Differentiating roles. Black Moon Rising as a scientist. He worked for Bill Greffey down in Florida on Mako's Jaws of Death, and Bill tells a really interesting story that Richard was just one of those guys that thanked God every day he was working. And when they were doing Mako Jaws of Death, there was some kind of little accident where Richard got hit in the head and was busted open and had to be rushed to the hospital for stitches. Well, Bill's figured that the day's shot, Richard's hurt, we got to wrap it up. But Richard came back and he said, what are you doing? You can't work. And he goes, yeah, I can. Just shoot me from this angle and you won't pick up on this stuff. So that's the kind of a guy he was. He just wanted to work. And unfortunately, what none of us realized, even him, as he was getting up there in his 60s, he started having physical problems. And they thought it was arthritis because he was always lifting weights. He was a beach bum. He loved the sun. And, you know, that was it. He was always in good shape. But all of a sudden he started slowing down. And I believe he got a role on Baywatch. Only lasted one season, but then he was brought back. But by then he was walking with a cane. And again, everybody said they thought it was arthritis. But the real culprit was, that nobody knew, was because of him being out in the sun, he got melanoma and it went into his bones. So here was this guy that was like, you know, so buff and such good shape and such an upbeat guy, stricken with this stuff. And unfortunately, you know, it prohibited him from keeping on working. And it wiped him out financially, and he tried to get into the old actor's home as a last resort because he was on his way out, and they wouldn't let him in for some reason because of the outstanding debt. It was only when Gregory Peck, who worked with him when he was a really young guy in a film called The Gunfighter, came to his behalf and said, look, you know, he's got to be in here. So he basically, you know, wound up in the old actor's home. And, you know, for a while he didn't want to see people, but other people had other friends in there they wanted to see, so they just dropped in him and tried to cheer him up. One was William Smith. And sadly, you know, Richard passed away around, I think he was 70. You know, and here's a guy, like I said, here's a guy who, you know, unfortunately the brass ring just kept out of his reach, but he was a steady worker, and just about everything, you know, and like, you know, he would get, you know, complete accolades for one role, like, you know, he was up for Best Supporting Actor in Once a Great Notion. And he says, you know, a lot of guys, you know, always promised them but never came through for him, and Paul Newman was the one guy who came through for him with that. Paul Newman had worked with him and promised him a role and got him a role that, you know, unfortunately he didn't get, you know, the Academy Award, but at least he was up for it. And he was, well, you know, his caliber of work was well worth any kind of an award. So, you know, again, this is one of the guys a lot of us grew up with, and, you know, was a familiar face in films, and a lot of people, you know, just, you know, I know who that is, I know who that is. Well, his name was Richard Jaeckel, and he was a good guy, great character actor, and from what I understand from reading this book, one hell of a human being. So, I'm going to wrap it up for now, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Stay sick, and if you want to buy Grindhouse Purgatory directly from me, because I just found out how much of a pittance I make from Amazon, I don't even want to fucking mention it here, because you'll think, why is he even doing this? Well, for one reason, to keep the genre alive, and because I always thought that Grindhouse Purgatory would only last one issue. Thanks to you guys, it's up to issue 15 we're working on now. So, again, stay sick. We'll see you on the flip side.